Is this some kind of joke to you, Mr. Carter? The question rang out across the humid wood-paneled courtroom, bouncing off the high ceilings and landing squarely on the small, stooped figure standing behind the defendant's table. Judge Marcus Harrison leaned over his bench, his face flushed a deep, impatient crimson that clashed violently with his black robes. He tapped his gavel once, not for order but for emphasis, the sharp crack causing the stenographer to flinch. Dennis Carter did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He was 84 years old, though the lines etched into his weather-beaten face suggested he had lived a century. He wore a red tweed blazer that had seen better days, the fabric slightly frayed at the cuffs and the elbows worn thin. It was a garment that looked out of place in the sterile gray atmosphere of the municipal court, a splash of vibrant, defiant color that seemed to offend the judge personally. "I asked you a question, sir," Judge Harrison boomed, his voice dropping an octave into a tone of forced authority. "We have a docket a mile long today. I have distracted driving cases, petty thefts and zoning disputes that actually matter. And yet here I am, staring at a man who thinks a court summons is an invitation to a silent pantomime. Speak up." Dennis remained silent. He looked up at the judge, his eyes a pale, watery blue, holding a gaze that was neither insolent nor afraid. It was simply present. He opened his mouth slightly, his jaw working as if he were trying to lubricate a rusted hinge, but no sound came out. He closed his mouth again, swallowing hard, the Adam's apple in his throat bobbing painfully. The prosecutor, a young man named Sterling who wore a suit that cost more than Dennis's car, sighed theatrically. He shuffled his papers, making sure the sound was audible to the gallery. "Your Honor, the defendant has been non-responsive since his arrest." The officers noted it in the report. He refused to answer questions at the scene, refused to sign the citation, and has refused to enter a plea. He is wasting the court's time. Judge Harrison narrowed his eyes, peering down his glasses at Dennis. "Is that it? You think you're above the law? You think because you're old you can just ignore the statutes of this county? You are charged with disturbing the peace and destruction of municipal property. And looking at that ridiculous jacket, I'd say you have a penchant for seeking attention." A titter of laughter rippled through the gallery. A few people in the back rows waiting for their own traffic hearings whispered to one another, pointing at the red tweed blazer. It was loud, bordering on garish, and on the slight frame of Dennis Carter it made him look like a caricature of a grandfather, something pulled from a children's book. Dennis's hands tightened on the railing of the defense table. His knuckles turned white. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He wanted to speak. He wanted to explain why he had been in the park at 3 in the morning with a shovel. He wanted to explain why the statue had to be cleaned. But the air in the room felt thick, heavy, choking him. "Mr. Carter," the judge said, his voice dangerously low, "I am going to ask you one last time to state your name for the record and enter a plea. If you do not open your mouth and speak to this court with the respect it deserves, I will hold you in contempt. I will verify your identity myself, and I will have you sit in a holding cell until you remember how to use your voice. Do you understand me?" Dennis nodded slowly. He took a breath, a ragged, wheezing intake of air that rattled in his chest. He parted his lips. He pushed the air up from his diaphragm, willing his vocal cords to engage, to form the words guilty with explanation. But all that came out was a soft, dry hiss. It was barely a whisper, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. The judge recoiled as if insulted. "Speak up," he roared, slamming the gavel down with enough force to shake the water pitcher on his desk. "Stop mumbling. This is a court of law, not a library." The silence that followed was ringing. Dennis lowered his head, his face burning. He touched the collar of his red blazer, his fingers grazing a small, uneven lump of scar tissue hidden beneath the shirt collar, a tactile reminder of why the volume of his voice was no longer his to command. The prosecutor, Sterling, stepped forward, smelling blood in the water. "Your Honor, I move for a psychiatric evaluation. Clearly the defendant is not competent. Look at him. He's dressed like a circus performer and refuses to communicate. He was found digging up city landscaping in the middle of the night. He's a danger to himself." Judge Harrison nodded, reaching for a new stack of paperwork. "I'm inclined to agree. If he wants to play the mute, he can do it in a state facility." Dennis looked up again, panic flaring in his eyes for the first time. He shook his head vigorously. He tapped his throat. He tried to gesture, to mime writing on a piece of paper. But the bailiff, a burly man who had been eyeing Dennis with annoyance since the morning began, stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt. "Stand down, sir," the bailiff warned. The humiliation was a physical weight. Dennis felt the eyes of the room on his back. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't crazy. He was just a man who had made a promise 50 years ago, a promise that required him to tend to a specific patch of earth in the town square, regardless of what the new city council decided to plant over it. But in this room, with the fluorescent lights buzzing like angry hornets and the judge's disdain radiating from the bench, Dennis Carter was just an old man in a funny red coat who didn't know when to quit. He felt a sudden sharp stab of memory, not of the courtroom but of heat, intense and suffocating. For a split second, the smell of floor wax vanished, replaced by the scent of burning diesel and copper. He wasn't in the courtroom. He was looking at the red tweed of his sleeve, but in the flash of memory, it wasn't tweed. It was the red dust of the Ashau Valley. It was the color of the earth that had stained his fatigues, the color of the blood that had soaked the bandage around his neck. The red blazer wasn't a fashion statement. It was the only thing he had found in the thrift store that matched the color of the dirt where he had left his voice. He wore it as a penance. He wore it so he would never forget the heat, the noise, and the silence that followed. The memory was gone as quickly as it came, shattered by the prosecutor's sneering voice. And that jacket, Sterling continued, pacing in front of the bench. It's practically an affront to the dignity of the court. It shows a lack of seriousness. In the back row of the gallery, wedged between a woman fighting a parking ticket and a man sleeping with his mouth open, sat Sarah Jenkins. She was 24, a junior clerk for a downtown firm, here only to take notes on a different case. She had been half listening, scrolling on her phone, until the prosecutor made the comment about the jacket. She looked up, her eyes narrowing. She watched the old man. She saw the way he stood, feet shoulder-width apart, back straight despite the stoop of his neck. It was a stance of discipline. She looked at the red tweed blazer. It was ugly, objectively speaking. But as Dennis turned slightly to look at the bailiff, the courtroom lights caught the lapel. There were 3 small holes in the left lapel. Pinholes. And the buttons, they weren't plastic. They were brass, tarnished almost to black, but they had a specific crest on them. Sarah squinted. Her grandfather had been military. He had taught her to look at the details. Uniforms tell a story, Sarah, he used to say. Even the ones that don't look like uniforms. She watched Dennis's hand go to his throat again, the way he rubbed the scar tissue. She saw the panic in his eyes, not of punishment but of being misunderstood. She looked at the judge, red-faced and bullying, and the prosecutor, smug and dismissive. Something was wrong here. She pulled out her phone, abandoning her notes. She opened a browser and typed in a search query, Vietnam veteran throat injury, unable to speak, Ashau Valley. It was a shot in the dark, based on the age of the man and the specific look of the trauma she could just barely see peeking above his collar. The results were generic. She tried again, searching for local legends. Local veteran hero, mute red jacket. Nothing. She looked back at the man, Dennis Carter. The judge had said the name. She typed, Dennis Carter veteran citation. A digitized newspaper archive from 1969 popped up. The headline was grainy, buried on page 4. Local soldier returns home. Silent hero. She clicked the PDF. It took agonizing seconds to load on the courthouse Wi-Fi. When it did, her breath hitched in her throat. The photo was black and white, showing a young, gaunt man in a hospital bed, his neck heavily bandaged. The caption read, Sergeant Dennis Carter, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, recovers at Bethesda. Doctors say he may never speak above a whisper again. Distinguished Service Cross. That was one step below the Medal of Honor. Sarah read the citation excerpt in the article. For extraordinary heroism, single-handedly holding a defensive perimeter, repeated exposure to enemy fire to rescue 3 wounded comrades, throat crushed by shrapnel while calling in air support. She looked up at the old man in the red blazer. He wasn't a senile gardener. He was a giant, and he was being treated like a nuisance by a man whose biggest struggle today was a backlog of traffic tickets. She had to do something. She couldn't just yell out. She'd be thrown out of court. She needed heavy artillery. She needed someone the judge couldn't ignore. She texted her boss, a senior partner who had served in the JAG Corps. Emergency. Courtroom 4B. Judge Harrison is about to jail a DSC recipient for being mute. Dennis Carter. You know the name? The 3 dots of a reply appeared instantly. Carter? The ghost of Tam Kai? Don't let him leave. I'm calling the base. Stall. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at the clock. It was 10:14 a.m. Back at the bench, Judge Harrison was losing the last of his patience. I've heard enough, the judge said, shuffling the papers into a neat stack. Mr. Carter, since you refuse to speak, and since you refuse to respect the decorum of this court with your attire and your attitude, I am finding you in contempt. Dennis's eyes widened. He took a step forward, his hand raising in a pleading gesture. He opened his mouth, forcing a rasping sound out. Please, he hissed. It sounded like steam escaping a valve. The judge waved a hand dismissively. "Save it. Bailiff, take Mr. Carter into custody. We'll schedule a psych eval for tomorrow morning. And get that jacket off him before he goes into the holding cell. It's a safety hazard." The bailiff moved forward, grabbing Dennis by the arm. The touch was rough, unconcerned with the frailty of the man beneath the fabric. Dennis flinched, his instincts flaring, but he didn't fight. He wouldn't fight his own countrymen. He allowed himself to be turned around. The bailiff reached for the collar of the red tweed blazer. "Let's go, old-timer. Off with the coat." "No," Dennis whispered, clutching the lapels. It was a desperate, rasping sound. It was the only armor he had left. "Stop." The voice didn't come from Dennis. It came from the back of the room. Sarah Jenkins had stood up, violating every rule of courtroom protocol she knew. The judge's head snapped up. "Young lady, sit down or you'll be joining him." "I can't do that, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice shaking but loud. "You're making a mistake. You can't arrest him." "I can and I will," Judge Harrison shouted. "Bailiff, remove her too." The bailiff looked torn, holding Dennis with one hand and looking at Sarah with confusion. The tension in the room snapped tight. The prosecutor looked annoyed. This was turning into a circus. "Just get him out of here," he muttered to the bailiff. The bailiff tugged hard on the red blazer. The sound of tearing fabric ripped through the quiet room. The seam at the shoulder gave way. Dennis let out a sound that wasn't a word. It was a cry of pure, heartbroken anguish, a wheezing sob that seemed to come from the bottom of his soul. He looked at the tear in the red fabric, the fabric that reminded him of the earth, and he looked defeated. Then, the phone on the judge's bench rang. It wasn't the soft chirping of a cell phone. It was the hardline secure phone that sat on the corner of the desk, the one that was only used for emergencies or direct lines from the state judiciary. It rang with a harsh mechanical trill that cut through the noise of the courtroom. Judge Harrison froze. He stared at the phone. It rang again. He picked it up, glaring at Sarah as if she had somehow caused it. "This is Judge Harrison." The room went silent. Everyone watched the judge's face. They saw the color drain from his cheeks. They saw his eyes widen behind his glasses. They saw his jaw go slack. Yes, sir. I understand who." He stood up, the phone cord stretching. "Yes, General. I will wait." He hung up the phone slowly, his hand trembling slightly. He looked at the bailiff. "Let go of him." The bailiff blinked. "Sir," I said, "unhand him." Judge Harrison barked, his voice cracking. "Step away from the defendant immediately." The bailiff released Dennis, who stumbled forward slightly, clutching his torn jacket. The judge looked at the doors of the courtroom. He looked terrified. "What is going on?" the prosecutor asked, stepping forward. "Your Honor, I demand." "Silence," the judge hissed, "just silence." For 10 seconds, nothing happened. The courtroom was a tableau of confusion. Dennis stood in the center, smoothing the torn fabric of his red blazer, his dignity shredded but his posture still upright. Then the vibration started. It was a low rumble, felt in the floorboards before it was heard. It grew louder, the sound of heavy engines idling outside the courthouse. Car doors slammed, not one or two but a dozen. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, not the shuffle of civilians, but the rhythmic, synchronized strike of boots. The courtroom doors didn't just open, they were thrown wide. 2 military police officers in full dress uniform stepped in, flanking the doorway. They stood at rigid attention. Behind them walked a man with 3 stars on his shoulders. Lieutenant General Vance, the base commander of the nearby Fort Ridley, strode into the municipal courtroom as if he owned the building. He was followed by a phalanx of officers, a mix of Army and Marines, their chests heavy with ribbons. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air pressure seemed to drop. The petty authority of the municipal court evaporated in the face of federal military power. General Vance didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the prosecutor. He walked straight to the defense table. He stopped 3 feet in front of Dennis Carter. The general, a man who commanded divisions, who had the ear of the president, slowly removed his cover and tucked it under his arm. He looked at the old man in the red blazer. He looked at the tear in the shoulder. His jaw tightened. "Sergeant Major," the general said, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the silent room. Dennis looked up. He recognized the rank. He recognized the respect. He instinctively straightened, his heels clicking together, his pain forgotten for a moment. General Vance raised his hand in a slow, crisp salute. Dennis returned it, his hand trembling slightly but his form perfect. The general held the salute for a long count of 3, then cut it. He turned slowly to face the bench. Judge Harrison was standing, but he looked like he wanted to hide under his desk. "General Vance, It became a military concern the moment you threatened to incarcerate a national treasure for a combat disability, General Vance said. His voice was cold steel. Do you know who this man is? The judge stammered. He is Dennis Carter. He was digging in the park. He is Sergeant Major Dennis Carter, Vance corrected, and he wasn't digging. He was maintaining the memorial for the 101st Airborne, which your city maintenance crew has neglected for 6 months. He was cleaning the names of the men who died under his command. The prosecutor tried to intervene. General, with all due respect, he refused to identify himself. He refused to speak. He physically cannot speak. Vance roared, the sound making the prosecutor jump back. Not in the way you want him to. He left his voice in a valley in 1968 so that 12 men could make it to the extraction point. The general turned to his aide, a captain holding a leather folder, read it. The captain stepped forward, opening the folder. His voice was projected, trained and clear. Headquarters, Department of the Army. General Orders Number 45. Award of the Distinguished Service Cross to Sergeant Dennis J. Carter. The room was spellbound. Even the man who had been sleeping in the back was awake, standing up, for extraordinary heroism, in connection with military operations involving conflict with an armed hostile force. Sergeant Carter distinguished himself by exceptionally valorous actions while serving as platoon sergeant. The captain read on, detailing the events of a night 50 years ago. He described how Dennis's platoon was overrun, how Dennis had stayed behind to man a machine gun, how he had been wounded 3 times, despite sustaining a crushing injury to the larynx from shrapnel. Sergeant Carter refused medical evacuation. Unable to shout commands, he moved from position to position, physically directing his men. He continued to expose himself to enemy fire to drag wounded soldiers to safety. The captain paused, then finished. His mute courage and refusal to yield served as an inspiration to his beleaguered platoon, directly resulting in the survival of the unit. The captain closed the folder. General Vance turned back to the judge. He can whisper, Judge Harrison. That is all he has left. He traded his voice for their lives, and you wanted to put him in a cage because he didn't say hello loudly enough. You mocked his attire. The general gestured to the red blazer. You called this a costume. This is the color of the 101st Unit patch. He wears it because he is the last surviving member of his platoon. He wears it to honor them, and your bailiff tore it. Judge Harrison was pale. He looked at Dennis, really looked at him for the first time. He saw the dignity, the sorrow, and the immense strength in the small frame. The judge's arrogance crumbled, replaced by a profound, sickly shame. Mr. Carter, the judge began, his voice weak. I didn't know. The docket, it didn't say. Dennis raised a hand. The room went deadly quiet. He looked at the general, then at the judge. He wanted to speak. He needed to speak. He took a step toward the bench. The bailiff stepped back, giving him a wide berth. Dennis placed his hands on the railing. He took a deep breath, wincing as the air passed through his scarred throat. He leaned in, closer to the microphone on the defense table. He closed his eyes, summoning every ounce of strength, channeling the memory of that night in the valley, the need to be heard one last time. It is not a costume, Dennis whispered. The microphone picked up the sound. It was raspy, broken, and filled with static, but it boomed through the courtroom speakers. It was a ghostly voice, a sound from the grave. It is my uniform. He paused, breathing hard, and silence is not disrespect. He looked at the judge, his blue eyes piercing. It is peace. The word hung in the air. Peace. The very thing he was accused of disturbing. Judge Harrison sank slowly into his chair. He looked small. He looked defeated. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Case dismissed, the judge said, his voice trembling. With prejudice. All charges are dropped. The record will be expunged. The judge looked at the bailiff, and the court will cover the cost of repairing the jacket and the landscaping. General Vance stepped forward, placing a hand on Dennis's shoulder. The good one. Thank you, Your Honor. We'll take it from here. He guided Dennis away from the table, but before they left, Dennis stopped. He turned to the back of the room. He looked at Sarah Jenkins, the young woman who had stood up when everyone else had stayed seated. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He just nodded to her, a slow, deliberate nod of gratitude. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She nodded back. The exit was a procession. The soldiers formed 2 lines, creating a corridor of honor leading out of the courtroom. As Dennis walked through, the officers snapped to attention. The civilians in the gallery stood up. It wasn't ordered. It was instinct. They stood for the old man in the torn red blazer. As Dennis passed the prosecutor's table, Sterling looked down at his expensive shoes, unable to meet the veteran's gaze. Outside the courthouse, the sun was blindingly bright. The air was fresh, smelling of rain and asphalt, a stark contrast to the stale air of the courtroom. General Vance walked Dennis to a waiting black SUV. "Sergeant Major, we have a medical team at the base who can look at that throat. New therapies, maybe help with the discomfort." Dennis smiled weakly. He tapped his chest. "I'm okay." Vance nodded. "And the memorial? I'll have a detail out there tomorrow. We'll fix it up. Proper stone, brass plaque. No one will touch it again. You have my word." Dennis reached out and took the general's hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. He pulled the general closer and whispered one last thing. "Don't fire the judge." Vance looked surprised. "He deserves it. He just needs to—" "Listen," Dennis wheezed. "Like you did." The general smiled, a genuine warm expression. "You're a better man than me, Dennis." Still, Dennis patted the general's hand, then climbed into the SUV. He sat back against the leather seat, closing his eyes. He touched the torn fabric of his red blazer. It could be mended. Everything could be mended, with enough time and enough care. The flashback came one last time, gentle now. Not the noise of the battle, but the quiet of the morning after. The smoke clearing. The faces of the men he had saved looking down at him as he lay on the stretcher. They were alive. They would go home. They would have children and grandchildren. The silence wasn't a curse. It was the price of their future, and it was a price he would pay 1,000 times over. As the convoy pulled away, leaving the stunned courthouse behind, the town went back to its business. But inside courtroom 4B, the air remained different. The judge sat in his chambers, staring at the wall, the silence of the room no longer feeling like authority but like a question he had to answer. He would never look at a defendant the same way again. He would never mistake quiet for weakness again. And in the park, the next day, a team of young soldiers worked quietly, polishing stone, planting flowers, and raising a flag over a patch of earth that was no longer just dirt but holy ground, guarded by the man in the red tweed blazer. If you enjoyed this story of justice and quiet valor, please like this video and subscribe to Veteran Valor Stories for more tributes to the heroes walking among us.